the outcome of the election would have been different had voters had access to that.
Do you think that there was voter fraud specifically?
So of course there's voter fraud.
I do want to understand how you went from just 2 years ago calling Trump's conduct downright abhorrent to then supporting.
I've said this during the campaign. If you were paying attention, I hate to break it to you, but there's the lack of originality in this.
Because you wrote in your book that the institution.
Are we still doing this, man? I mean, because I think that like
the book is 2 years old. Trump does win in 2024. Would you consider working in his cabinet?
Welcome back to Rattlesnake TV, guys. In this video, we're going to be covering a new debate between Vivek Ramaswamy and a Mediaite journalist. Now, this debate covers some very, very important ground, from election fraud and integrity to the left's recent treatment of JD Vance. And then at the end, Vivek reveals some important information about his next move when questioned if he is going to be in the Trump cabinet. So with that, let's get into the first bit. And this bit gets progressively more heated about election integrity.
Now, I want to talk about the media and the 2024 election. Donald Trump, who you support, still hasn't conceded the last election, which creates a challenge for the media, which has to now prepare for the likelihood that if he does lose this next one, he will claim that it was stolen as well. Can I just say a word about that, just to provide some level of historical context? Donald Trump is now running, it would look like, against Kamala Harris, who back in 2016 called Donald Trump an illegitimate president. Hillary Clinton said the election of 2016 was an illegitimate election, that there was Russian interference that caused Americans across the board, especially on the Democratic side of the aisle, to question the outcome of that election, the legitimacy of that presidency. So I do think that, I hope that what happened in the last month, and here I'm referring to the assassination attempt that, thank God, was not successful, if that is a wake-up call to all of us, let it be that we can't resort to histrionics in our politics to say one candidate or the other is an existential threat to democracy, but instead to have a reasoned, thoughtful exchange of competing visions for the country. Donald Trump offers a very different vision for the future of the country than that which Kamala Harris offers. That's fine. The beauty of the country is we ought to be able to have that and air that debate in a way that voters are actually able to make that choice without feeling like they have a gun to their head, literally or metaphorically, with respect to the threats of the existence of democracy, which I just don't think is constructive. So if you want to go to sort of election denialism or whatever, who started it, this discussion could go back to Bush v. Gore. You have people who didn't vote to certify that election. I just think looking backwards to that, I just don't find it that constructive versus an honest and rich and, when needed, contentious debate between competing visions for the future. Well, you've said that the 2020 election was stolen by big tech. What do you mean by that? Lay out that argument for us.
Well, look, I think that what we know, right, I stick to facts, right? What we know is that certain stories were systematically suppressed that would have, we know through polling, had an impact on the outcome of the election. The most notable of them, you will well know, is the Hunter Biden laptop story. Not only was that dismissed, it was systematically suppressed. The New York Post, the fourth largest newspaper in circulation, founded by Alexander Hamilton, had its own account locked on Twitter, now X, then Twitter, that stopped them from even publishing a story that we now know to be true, but was dismissed systematically. If you were on Facebook or other messaging platforms, even in the equivalent of email, if you were to try to share that story from the New York Post, that was suppressed. I think that had a more profound impact on the outcome of the election than any magnitude of political consultant-made advertisements on television. If you look at a lot of the polling, independents who answered afterwards said if they had been exposed to that information, it would have caused them to evaluate the candidates differently. I think that's regrettable. I don't think we want to live in a country where large, quasi-monopolistic, coordinated with state actors, tech companies, are suppressing the information that's available to the voting public. I don't think that that's good for democracy. I don't think that's good for America. And I hope we don't repeat those same mistakes next time around, which is why I've been so intent on pointing that out.
This is a slightly different argument that you make from Trump's claim, which is that the election was stolen through outright fraud. Do you disagree with that claim from Trump?
So look, I've shared with you what my views are. I ran in the primary, and I have my views. I do think that the strongest case for election interference in the 2020 election, it's driven by data, is that the outcome of the election would have been different had voters had access to that. Do
you think that there was voter fraud specifically?
So of course there's voter fraud.
Before we get to the next clip, guys, if you don't mind liking the video, that does help me a lot, considering that I do face quite a bit of censorship on this channel and also subscribing to the channel as well if you're enjoying it here. And don't forget to check out the Reality Based store, guys. We've got new merch coming out every single week. I am wearing the Life's Tough Get a Helmet shirt today, one of my favorites, and we've got so much more. So make sure to browse that catalog just below and see what you like. And also, if you do buy something, you're helping me stay independent. So just go to realitybasedstore.com. Links are all below. See what you like. Let's get back to the video.
That's well known.
Enough
the open question. That's the open question. That's the open question. And here's where I am. I said this earlier. I'm going to say it again. The only point of talking about this is, are we going to make for a better country in the future by making changes? Here's what I do favor. I think this would be healing for the country. I think this would be a massive step forward for public trust in the United States of America. If we accepted a system of single-day voting on Election Day, make it a national holiday, a uniting day to say this is one day we all take to think about our civic duties. We cast that ballot with mandatory government-issued ID to match the voter file. And you look at what's happening with CrowdStrike or other risks recently, paper ballots to backstop it. If we get to that place, which I think most Democrats, most Republicans find to be reasonable, then I'll commit to you that I would lead the way, and I believe most Republicans, I'd call on them to do it too, to be done with election complaints about election integrity, questioning the outcomes of elections. I will pledge to be vehemently opposed to doing any of that in the future if we get to a rational system of how we conduct elections that actual Americans have public trust in.
You said it's an open question, which is notable because you wrote the opposite in your book in 2022, just 2 years ago. You wrote that you accepted the results of the election. You said that there was no evidence of fraud, that U.S. security.
I haven't seen evidence, right? No. The fraud of a scale that would have this, of course.
Right. You said it was an open question.
Documented cases of it. Can I just ask a question? I mean, I'm interested in the future. So I said I was having this discussion. It's what I've said several times in this discussion. I want to make the United States of America a better country. I don't think it is productive for either side to go back and obsess over relitigating the past. And the only reason I'm even bringing up the Hunter Biden laptop story, you asked about it, is because I think there are lessons for it for the future. What's the lesson here? I believe our country would be better off if we strengthened our election integrity and public trust in elections with voter ID requirements, make it single day, make it a national holiday to permit everyone to do it. And I think that will actually bring the country together. So I'm just not interested in having retroactive games of which side said what, when, as gotchas from Republicans doing it or Democrats doing it. I'm just not interested in it. I think I'm interested in the future of the country. And I do think that this is part of the reason why you have public loss of trust, not just in government, but in the media and other institutions. My best advice to the Republican Party, and I think the Democrats would probably be well served with the same, and our country would definitely be well served by it, is if both parties offer a vision for the future, learning from the past, yes, but a vision for the future to say, here's how we're going to make it for a stronger United States of America. That's just the scope of what I'm interested in right now, 100 days out, less than 100 days out from one of the most important elections, if not most important election of my lifetime. That's where I think I'm interested in spending my airtime. And if you are, I'd love to join you in that.
So when it comes to election integrity, this is such an important conversation when it comes to the context of the rest of the year. Because if the USA uses the same system as they did last time, and then Kamala Harris ends up beating Donald Trump, you can only imagine the sort of civil unrest that could occur. And for those who do pray for the downfall of America, this would be the best case scenario. You see, Vivek is absolutely right, and he's holding his tongue here about the 2016 election, just for an example. They were calling Donald Trump an illegitimate president, and then for years, they were hounding on about Russian interference, saying that Russia influenced the election in favor of Donald Trump.
Top Trump officials, including the president's son, Donald Trump Jr., his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, his campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, and Manafort's deputy, Rick Gates, conspired with the Russian government and its military spy agency to hurt Democratic presidential nominee Hillary Clinton and help Donald Trump by hacking the computer networks of the Democratic Party.
The only difference is the Republican side didn't stage a false flag event to make the Democrats look like insurrectionist maniacs. I mean, BLM kind of painted that picture all themselves. So the only reason why anybody wouldn't want to fix the obviously broken system and have single-day voting with no mail-in ballots, where everyone votes and it's a national holiday, is if the dodgy system that currently exists favored you, and if you were actually happy to open the door to voter fraud with mail-in ballots and the rest.
Look at my brother's, who's a Democrat. It says 4212D, that's Democrat. Then you go here, because we're both the same address anyway, 4212R. Oh my God, they can see who my political affiliation is.
So with the state of things at the moment, I would be genuinely very concerned for the country if the right-wing, populist, nationalist, MAGA part of the population thought that they had another election stolen from them. Because it's at a point now where the endless wars, the $35 trillion in national debt, the cultural degeneracy, the homelessness, the fentanyl, the indoctrination and sexualization of children in schools and in the media.
We have created a school where everybody gets to be themselves.
Protect trans kids! Protect trans kids! Protect trans kids!
Is destroying the country to the point where in the not so distant future, it might become irreversible. And then if somebody like Kamala Harris is elected, then all of those issues would get way worse because she is a far leftist ideologically. And it would be a devastating blow that would surely send the country off the edge. And I think a lot of people in America and around the world for that matter kind of get that. So on to the next bit now, where the interviewer tries to continue with the similar sort of line of annoying and repetitive questions, and then Vivek starts to roast him subtly and then more overtly.
Yeah. Well, forgive me for asking about the past, but this isn't ancient history. This is 2 years ago, and Donald Trump is running for re-election again, and you're supporting him. And I think it's important to understand. And the reason I ask about your book is that it was published just 2 years ago. And in it,
yeah, just open it up and quote it right now. Do you have it handy?
Yeah, I got it.
I'm not. Yeah, okay,
so we've got the quote that I think went viral when you were running in the primary was when you were writing about January 6th. You wrote, "It was a dark day for democracy. The loser of the last election refused to concede the race, claimed the election was stolen, raised hundreds of millions of dollars from loyal supporters, and is running for executive office again."
And that person's name was Stacey Abrams, is what I said in the book. And then
you said it was Donald Trump.
And then I put in Donald Trump.
Yeah.
So look, I've been very clear about this, and I think we just have a difference of interests in what we think is really important for the country. My time, as yours is, I'm sure, limited. All of ours is. I think that it is best served for the country to focus on how we take all of the learnings of the last 5, 10, and 20 years as a country to marshal that to a different vision of how we make our country stronger. That's what I'm interested in. I ran for president because I'm deeply worried about the future existence of the United States. I think we're skating on thin ice. And I just don't think it is productive to engage in this retrospective gotcha games. I could do it in reverse for the last 25 years amongst Democrats, and you're tempting me to. But I just don't think that's productive. And I think that this is part of what's the poison in the United States of America, as opposed to having honest, earnest, competing visions for the future. All right. So I hope, as a fellow citizen, from one to another, I hope that's not too much to ask.
I appreciate
if it is, I think that we're in trouble. But if it's not, and two people who have maybe differing views on the past or whatever are able to have a constructive discussion about competing visions for the future, even if they're deeply different ones, that I think is good. I think relitigating and playing gotcha games, we both could do this, dating back for 20 years, from Hillary Clinton to Al Gore to his supporters, to the people who didn't certify that election, to Nancy Pelosi not seating a democratically elected congressman from Iowa in the same election that Trump lost, to the big tech interference in the last election. I'm not interested in that. It seems that that's what you're interested in. My ask to you would be, how about we have a productive discussion about competing visions? They're very different visions for the future.
We don't have to relitigate the 2020 election anymore, but I do want to understand how you went from just 2 years ago calling Trump's conduct downright abhorrent to then supporting him.
I've said this during the campaign, if you were paying attention to the campaign, and maybe we'll just agree that, because I find this to be a little bit of a waste of time if we're just mired in a past, and I think there's just more productive ways to spend time than this. But
I think it's a reasonable question how you went from calling him abhorrent to supporting him. I hate to break it to you, but there's the lack of originality in this. Of somebody who ran a presidential campaign has been like, yes. I have yet to heard the question answered.
So I think the facts that came out surrounding what the government initially put out around January 6th versus facts that came out later did have a palpable change on my perspective. The fact that there were video files and evidence that was withheld for a very long time that later became public. The fact that there were people charged, and I'm pretty civil libertarian to my core. I was against a lot of the post 9/11 actions that the government took. I was against a lot of holding even alleged terrorists without the due process rights that we think are afforded by our constitutional heritage. When you learned a lot of what happened, then my views did evolve. Yes, they did. And I was very open about that in my interviews with CNN to everybody else. I just think it's more productive not to rehash things that we've already talked about ad nauseum versus actually maybe broaching some new territory at an interesting point in our country's future.
Okay, so in your view, because you wrote in your book that the institution...
Are we still doing this, man? I mean, because I think that, like...
The book is 2 years old. It's a reasonable question to ask.
I think your complete absence of interest in... I've raised the possibility of it a few times. Your demonstrated absence of an iota of interest in actually discussing two important competing visions for the future within 100 days of an election, and instead to go back and try to line edit and nitpick and airlift when we've had an entire year of I'm not a new character here, okay? Ran for U.S. president, from CNN to everybody else. We've been through this. That footage exists. I find this to be and I've explained it, we can do it again ad nauseum. I just don't think it's productive versus offering. Like, why are you so reluctant to engage in a competing vision of the future? I think there are differences of opinion on where the country should go. Why the reluctance to talk about it in the short time that we do have? And it is a short time, I'm sorry to say.
Well, you've laid out in your book very persuasively how Trump threatens institutions when he left office.
People can read my book. It's called Nation of Victims. You could check it out. It's the second book I've written 4 books in the last 3 years. Each one successively builds on what my views were on the last one. Woke Inc. was my first. I've openly said I agree with about 95% of what's in there, not 100%. I've written 4 books in 3 years. The 4th is coming out later this year. Read them. That's great. I have laid out what my views are with clarity. And my top view right now on this set of questions is we have a chance to fix the issue of public trust in elections. We have lost our collective American sense of public trust in elections. Kamala Harris, to Hillary Clinton, to Stacey Abrams, to a lot of figures on the left as well, have questioned the outcomes of elections. I don't think that's good. I don't want conservatives to continue to have to be in a position to do the same thing.
So this guy has 45 minutes of Vivek's time, and this is the line of questioning that he goes with. I mean, either he is mildly deaf and can't understand what Vivek's saying and can't read the room and understand that Vivek is about to cut this interview short, or he's just playing dumb and maybe wants to get a heated moment that goes viral. And like Vivek said, there are much more productive ways to have this conversation. And also, in terms of what Vivek said a few years ago, who really cares? Like he said, there's an election happening soon. And also, the United States are on the brink of World War III. They're currently sending Navy ships to the Middle East, and they're still funding the war in Ukraine. Plus, Trump was just nearly assassinated. So what we're looking at here towards the end of the year in November when the election happens is the most consequential election surely in United States history. So as a journalist, I mean, move on quicker. There are a lot of things on the horizon that are much more interesting. I mean, this is a very serious moment. But anyways, on to the next part now, where they talk about JD Vance. Now, recently, the media has been rallying against Vance and calling him weird. That's their new thing.
You guys are just weird. That's who they are.
It's the weirdest thing. He'll go and like literally hug an American flag. Now, I love the flag, but I mean, it's like weird what he does.
I mean, on the other side, they're just weird. I mean, they really are.
So let's get into this part. Then I'm going to add some clips for context, and we're also going to look at JD Vance's response to these claims and a little bit more.
Now, you objected this week to Democrats trying to frame the Trump-Vance ticket as weird, which is the new talking point of the Harris campaign. You called it dumb and juvenile. Is that what you mean when you talk about the free, mature exchange of ideas? Do you think that political candidates should aspire for more mature rhetoric and debate?
I think that mislabeling or just substituting for debate, instead castigating an entire group of people as weird, I think is problematic. And I can go into it in some depth here. I think America and our heritage, our founding fathers, were in some sense weird compared to old world standards, right? Benjamin Franklin invented the lightning rod. He invented the bifocal spectacle. Thomas Jefferson invented a swivel chair, a polygraph test. They had beliefs. I mean, Joseph Priestley was welcomed to the United States from old world England because he had beliefs that defied the traditional Anglican church. So I just think part of what makes America great is that we don't dismiss ideas based on being weird. And even worse, we don't just say, oh, you're a group of people who has a heterodox idea. That's weird and I'm not going to engage in it. The way we're going to actually engage each other is by engaging in the content of our own ideas. So I do think that it is a little bit adolescent, a little juvenile to say, whoa, they're weird. No, I don't think that's the way we should do it. And by the way, I try to be consistent. I think when I ran my campaign, a lot of Republicans had a different view, right? They said that we just want to go back to a normal America. You didn't hear that from me, right? Because normal compared to what? Weird compared to what? I don't just care about making America great again. I care about making America greater than it has ever been before. I think if your allegation against the other side is that they're weird, there's two problems with that. One is it denies the possibility of exceptionalism. Okay, Albert Einstein famously didn't wear socks. Nikola Tesla had a weird issue with the number 3. You could go straight down the list. There's some German philosopher, his name is slipping my mind, but his famous quote is, "The only thing worse than madness is the utter absence of it altogether, which leads to imbecility." And America's the opposite of that spirit. So it denies the possibility of exceptionalism. It got under my skin a little bit. Even see a guy like Pete Buttigieg use the word weird multiple times over the weekend to talk about J.D. Vance and Donald Trump. It kind of hurts a little bit because I knew Pete in college, actually. And one of the things that's almost certainly true about him is he was probably viewed as weird for much of the 90s, growing up as a hyper-articulate, scholastic, high-achieving gay person in the 1990s in Indiana. And that's too bad. But when I got to know him, he wasn't somebody in college who I remembered as denigrating people who disagreed with him as weird. And that's one of the reasons I actually respected him. So the other thing is it actually makes national unity impossible, right? When you designate the other side as weird, now what are Republicans in a position to do? Well, I think Republicans could have at least as strong of a case saying you're weird because you can't define a woman, because you want to fight for men competing with women in women's sports, because you want to take away our gas stoves. That's weird. And then it becomes a context of which side is more weird, measured against a self-referential standard, as opposed to saying that, you know what? American exceptionalism involves embracing ideas that might seem weird at the time. J.D. Vance, maybe you like his solutions, maybe you don't, but our fertility crisis is a major problem in this country. We're well below replacement rate, and we're going to an economic Armageddon if we get to a ratio of workers to retirees that's less than 2 to 1, which we hit in the year 2060. But the problem with this level of discourse about labeling the other side weird is no one's talking about that, which is, I do think, a, if not existential, major economic ticking time bomb for the country, and instead talking about which side is weird versus not. It just feels un-American to me.
Right.
And so, yes, calling that out in forceful terms, I think is useful if we're able to also progress that discussion to say that we're not in the business of calling one side weird. And I haven't, I challenge you to take the hundreds of hours of footage of whether I've ever leveled that accusation against a Democrat. No, I haven't. Am I one of these people who say, I want America to be normal? What is normal? America's exceptional. That's a worldview. And I think that it is anti-American to charge at the other side the idea that somehow the fact that they're weird, it's the TikTok era's way of saying basket of deplorables. Basket of deplorables was to the Facebook era what weird is to the TikTok era. And I just don't think it's productive for our country, our culture, or the possibility of national solidarity. And so, yes, I am against it. And I stand by that.
So I'm certainly not convinced about J.D. Vance as a VP pick. I mean, I think it should have been Vivek. I think that's pretty clear by now. But like I said, this is the left's strategy. They want to call him weird. Now, I can understand questions about his loyalty to Trump. That's a fair criticism. I can understand criticisms about the way he views America's foreign policy. But weird, I mean, coming from the left, that is a bold claim. And now let's look at some of the clips that people have been roasting him about.
We're effectively run in this country via the Democrats, via our corporate oligarchs, by a bunch of childless cat ladies who are miserable at their own lives and the choices that they've made, and so they want to make the rest of the country miserable too. And it's just a basic fact. You look at Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, AOC, the entire future of the Democrats is controlled by people without children. And how does it make any sense that we've turned our country over to people who don't really have a direct stake in it? I just wanted to ask that question and propose that maybe if we want a healthy ruling class in this country, we should invest more, we should vote more, we should support more people who actually have kids, because those are the people who ultimately have a more direct stake in the future of this country.
Man, if you had called for, I don't know, lowering tax rates to 0 or invading Canada or, I don't really know what, making the death penalty mandatory for people who don't get the vaccine, something really radical, they wouldn't even have noticed. The Atlantic would have just nodded. But saying something like that drove them, insane. Why?
Well, I think first is because it actually hit a nerve. I mean, these people recognize that they're unhappy. They live in one-bedroom apartments in New York City. They've played their entire lives to win a status game. They're obsessed with their jobs. They're obsessed with their wealth and with their fortunes. And they look at middle America, people who are actually pretty happy with their lives and the choices that they've made, and they hate normal Americans for choosing family over these ridiculous D.C. and New York status games. And I think because of that, they just get so angry when somebody calls it what it is. It's acceptable if they ignore that it never happens, but when somebody calls out that, look, if you're a miserable cat lady, you should not force your misery on the rest of the country, they just get really upset about it. And I think, by the way, Tucker, it's a good thing that they get upset about it. It suggests that they know that we're hitting a nerve, not just in this campaign, but with this message that we should invest in American families in this country. If nothing else, we should be about healthy, stable families.
I'll go back to something I said earlier about we need to reward the things that we think are good and punish the things that we think are bad. So you talk about tax policy. Let's tax the things that are bad and not tax the things that are good. If you're making $100,000, $400,000 a year, and you've got 3 kids, you should pay a different, lower tax rate than if you're making the same amount of money and you don't have any kids. It's that simple.
I totally agree.
So clearly, JD Vance believes that the fertility problem is a big issue in the United States, and I would completely agree with him about that. And if you don't address the declining birth rate, then you will end up like Japan and South Korea, who are heading for actual extinction over the next 100, 200 years. And also, he believes that people who are making decisions about the future of the country should probably have children. They should have some skin in the game, because then that way they might actually care about the direction of the country and the country that their children and grandchildren are going to live in, rather than just their own interests and their own bank accounts. And now that is an area where I'm in total agreement with JD Vance. So anyways, let's hear what he had to say in response to this.
Every time the Democrats attack us and attack our movement, they can't help but tell on themselves. They reveal how much they hate the American people. Now remember this. Remember, Barack Obama said we cling to God and guns. Remember that? Hillary Clinton called us deplorables. And now Kamala Harris says we're weird. Well, Kamala, I'm glad you brought that up. Let's talk about some things that are weird. We think it's weird that Democrats want to put sexually explicit books in toddlers' libraries. We think it's weird that the far left wants to allow biological males to beat the living crap out of women in boxing. We think it's weird for a presidential candidate to bail convicted rapists and murderers out of prison, and that's what Kamala Harris did. And I think it's especially weird when Kamala Harris comes to Atlanta, I believe came here to this arena. Kamala Harris comes to Atlanta and talks with a fake Southern accent, even though she grew up in Canada. You can't make it up. That's pretty weird.
So, an accurate response there. I like this meme. The left. JD Vance is weird. Also the left. So, if it was a weird competition, I think the left would have a very rough night at the office. And now onto the last bit, where Vivek touches on the fertility crisis a little bit more, as well as what might be next for him.
I think that our country is in trouble if our political discourse and the kind of argument we make depends on which side labels the other as weird or nonconformist, because it requires a reference standard that is something other than the United States of America as a whole. Instead, I think the right question is, how are we going to make America greater than it's ever been before? And the number one way we're going to do that is by actually engaging in the open exchange of even unconventional ideas. And we would be remiss if we didn't get to the content of what spawned this. We have a fertility crisis in this country. Countries from Hungary to Singapore have adopted what we would view as extreme measures to address that problem, still with very limited success. And so the idea that because J.D. Vance proposed some level of solutions, maybe they're the right solutions, maybe they're the wrong ones, and you have completely entitled to your view on whether those are the right or wrong solutions. I think that we repress the kind of innovative culture if we just say, if you say something that falls outside of my version of an Overton window, you're weird and your people who agree with you are weird. I don't think that's productive. I do think that having a competing vision from a Democrat that says, you know what, I would approach this differently, but here's how we would deal with the fertility crisis that's compelling. That's what I see is actually missing. And that's where I want to see our body politic go. We're not there now, but I think we can get there. And I think it's a big part of why I'm interested in conversations like the one that you and I are having. I'm interested in potential private sector action, to de-silo the media and cultural commentary and political landscape. And you know what? If I was to go back and run for president, for all of the political disadvantages that strategy presented, I would still go back and do it again the exact same way, because I just think that is what the country needs right now. And, you know, I'm hopeful that, and I know this, most ordinary Americans are rooting for the same thing. I just hope more people in the political leadership do the same.
But I'm wondering from you, looking forward to the future, if Trump does win in 2024, would you consider working in his cabinet?
Yeah, of course I would. I want to have a maximal impact on the country. I'm also considering other paths. For me, the top focus is a lot changes, depends on what happens in the next several months leading up to the election. And so my focus is on doing whatever I can to make a positive contribution to the right outcome in November. After that, one of the things I found is that when I make my own personal elaborate plans, it never goes according to that plan anyway. I'm guided by the same purpose that led me to the presidential race in the first place, which is that I do think that we're in the middle of a kind of national identity crisis, a loss of ourself, a sense of who we are as a nation. I ran for president because I think that there's an opportunity still to fill that gap, especially to reach the next generation. There's a number of paths for what's ahead for me, whether it's through the executive branch, whether it's through the legislative branch, whether it's in the state of Ohio versus at a national scale. I'm evaluating all of those possibilities, but you know, we're going to have to see what happens this November before we jump the shark there.
So a few options there for Vivek. I mean, I personally would love to see him join Trump's cabinet in some form. I'd like to see him close to Trump because he would be a great advisor. And also, last clip we're going to have a look at is Vivek's messaging recently about the Republicans actually having to have a reset. And I think this is such a good point.
I do believe that we need a bit of a reset in this campaign. If we're being honest and being clear-eyed, I think the reality is Kamala's new de facto nomination, coronation, whatever you want to call it, after the Republican convention was a bit of a shock that caught a lot of Republicans by blindside. And the reality is we now have to take a big step back and say, we're going to offer our own vision of what we stand for. I think the attacks on Kamala alone are not going to be enough. We're already seeing that over the last week. I think we have to stand for our own alternative vision that we believe in merit. The reason that we're critical of identity politics isn't because we're against the Democrats. It's because we stand for meritocracy, and that's part of who we are as Americans. And so as much as I'm critical of the Democrats, I also think now is a moment for a wake-up call on our own side. We need to use this as a chance to reset and level set and focus on our own vision for the future of this country. And the more we do that, the more successful we're going to be. Frankly, the less we do it, the more risk I do see heading into November.
So I would agree with that. And I'd say that the Republicans probably do need to have a reset and should not get complacent at all. Because say what you want about the Kamala Harris camp, it's going to be a huge year and the messaging and the optics are going to be so important for them moving forward. And the Republicans can't afford to be out of touch because that can be a real weakness of theirs. So anyways, guys, don't forget to check out Reality Based Store. Best merch in the game. And also don't forget to like the video, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. And if you'd like to watch another video right here. Till next time, I'm Jake. This is RattlesnakeTV, keeping you armed and dangerous.